My name is Mara Posada, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of Public Affairs, Planned Parenthood South Texas, based here in San Antonio. With me today is Joshua Prager. Mr. Prager has written for The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal. His most recent book is The Family Roe, An American Story. A former Harvard Nieman Fellow, he is also author of The Echoing Green, a Washington Post Best Book of the Year. Mr. Prager lives in New Jersey. Copies of The Family Roe will be available in the Nowhere Bookshop tent across the street. Joshua Prager, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I wonder if we could start today's conversation with a reading from your book, The Family Roe. I understand you've selected a passage.
Yes, thank you. The book took me 11 years when I started. I didn't have reading glasses, but now I do. So I'll just read one quick page from the beginning, from the sort of introduction. Roe v. Wade was so named for its pseudonymous plaintiff, Jane Roe, and its defendant, Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade. But at its heart, the case did not pit Roe against Wade. It pitted her against the fetus she was carrying, and the court's ruling alluded, if only obliquely, to the existence of the child that fetus became. Wrote Blackman, the normal 266-day human gestation period is so short that the pregnancy will come to term before the usual appellate process is complete. Blackman was making a simple legal point. It did not matter that the gestation of a lawsuit is longer than the gestation of a baby. The case had not been rendered moot because its plaintiff was no longer pregnant. But Blackman did not write that Jane Roe had given birth, and the public was left to assume that Jane Roe, whoever she was, had gotten the abortion made legally available to her. Normally, a plaintiff is required to use her real name. The federal rules of civil procedure demand it. But owing to the stigma of abortion, an exception was made in Roe, and Blackman addressed it. Despite the use of the pseudonym, he wrote, no suggestion is made that Roe is a fictitious person. Jane Roe was real. Her name was Norma McCorvey. And when, in 2010, I read an article that mentioned that Roe had been decided too late for Norma to have an abortion, I wondered about the baby she'd placed for adoption 40 years before. I decided to look for her. Months after Norma gave birth to that child in 1970, she met her lifelong partner, Connie Gonzalez. Norma had just left Gonzalez when, in June 2010, I visited Gonzalez at her Dallas home. She told me that the stories Norma had told about herself were not true. Gonzalez's home was due to be foreclosed on when I returned to see her the next year. She pointed me to a cache of papers that Norma had left behind in the garage and did not want. Looking through her speeches and letters, her holy cards and sheet music, I wondered not only about the Roe baby, but about the other two daughters Norma had let go. I wondered also about Norma. Lifting a picture of Norma as a toddler atop a pony, I looked at the little house behind her up on piers and wondered too about her family rooted there on the banks of a Louisiana river.
Thank you. As you mentioned, this book took you 11 years to research and write. And you mentioned a bit about what inspired you to write this book. Can you talk a little bit more about that as far as your inspiration for the book?
Absolutely. I had no idea what I was getting into. I can tell you that. I have written over the years about people whose lives are connected to history, and often about things that were unknown about some big historical thing. To give you one example, there was one anonymous winner, only one ever in the history of the Pulitzer Prizes. Somebody had taken a photograph of an execution in Iran during the Islamic Revolution. And 25 or so years after that picture was taken, I saw it and saw the word anonymous and had the idea that it would be interesting to find him or her. And I did. I went to Iran and they had a remarkable story and they confided it in me and I wrote about it. And so, as I mentioned there, the idea that somewhere there was, as those opposed to Roe called her, the Roe baby, somewhere there was someone whose conception had led to Roe, led Norma to file Roe v. Wade, it struck me, my guess was that he or she, who was then 40 years old, likely knew who they'd been born to, who their biological mother was, and that would be a very difficult thing to carry. And so I ended up looking for that person. And then very quickly after I found her name is Shelley Lynn Thornton. Took me about a year or so to find her. After I found her, she first said, I did not wish to participate. And I made sure, I'll just add that I didn't reach out to her directly in case she didn't know who she'd been born to. I reached out first to the mother who had raised her. She said she didn't wish to participate. And I said, fine, I will not write about you against your wishes. I then reached out to the other two children Norma had given birth to. Norma was gay, but occasionally had sort of male partners and had given birth to 3 children, given them all up for adoption, relinquished them to adoption. Those 2 women wanted to participate. And then after I met them and they met each other, I told that to Shelley. She then decided that she did wish to participate. And very quickly, my interest grew from those 3 daughters to include Norma, then to include Roe v. Wade, and then the whole of abortion in America. And my approach was simply that I would sort of look at this larger issue, this enormous issue in this country, not through politics, but people. And so as to do that, so as to humanize the issues, I surrounded Norma and her family with 3 other characters, a doctor named Curtis Boyd, a doctor named Mildred Jefferson, and a lawyer named Linda Coffey, who had been Norma's lawyer, who initially filed Roe. And so that was really my approach. And as you say, it took a decade. It was a big project.
Right. And I think one of the things when you're talking about Norma herself, I mean, you begin the book by including a family tree and a detailed family history of Norma McCorvey. What was her ancestry, if you could tell us, and why was it important to give the reader this context?
That's a great question. You know, again, sort of this journalism credo to tell the macro through the micro, tell the larger story through the human beings. I am very much pro-choice, but I did not set out to write this book as an advocate. I wanted to write it as a journalist, to be as sort of fair and balanced as I possibly could. But one remarkable thing is you don't need to tell people what happens when as an advocate might, what happens when a woman is not allowed to have a legal abortion. If you show it, if you show what happens to a woman who's denied it, then it is very powerful. And so it was incredible for me to, when I looked back at Norma's history, she was the 3rd consecutive generation of women in her family who had gotten pregnant, unhappily so, all 3 when they were 17 years old. And then I wrote about what happened to these women. And so just to step back 1 generation, Norma's mother, Mary, was living in rural Louisiana. And she got pregnant, as I say, when she was 17 years old. And her family, they had been very religious. And they were, when Mary got pregnant, they were sort of horrified by this. And so they did something really horrible. They made her leave her town. She was disappeared and she went to the big city, Baton Rouge. She gave birth. And then her parents took that child and raised the child as her own. And Mary went back to her home on the opposite side of the Atchafalaya River. Had to pretend that this child was her niece and not her daughter. Now that was a devastation. And she then became an alcoholic. And after she got married, she and her husband had a miserable marriage. And this was the home in which Norma grew up in. Sex was something illicit, sinful, and they then became Jehovah's Witnesses, the family. The father sort of hoped that his wife, who had many, many partners outside of her marriage, sexual partners, that she might sort of be reformed, but she was not. And what ended up happening was Norma grows up in this home where, as I say, sex was something sinful and illicit, and all the more so when she then, first she's sent off to school for quote unquote delinquent children, right around 12, 13 years old. She starts getting in trouble. And then she comes out to her parents, says she's gay. And when she does this, her mother beats her. Her mother told me that sort of unapologetically. And then what really happens is Norma drops out of school. She gets married at 16 to a man she barely knows, someone who had picked her up where she was a car hop selling hamburgers. She gets pregnant and their marriage quickly dissolves. And Norma thinks she might wish to raise that child, but she is completely unfit to be a mother and relinquishes the child to adoption. She then starts taking a lot of drugs, sells drugs, for a short time becomes a prostitute. None of these things were known previously about her. Norma had concocted sort of life stories about herself that she told in various books that were not true. When she is then pregnant for the third time, she realizes, I do not wish to go through this again. I want to have an abortion. But she can't get an abortion. She lied often. One of the lies that she told was that she had gone to an abortion clinic and it had just been shuttered, and it was very dramatic. There was dried blood all over the floor. It reeked of death, she said. In truth, the truth was much simpler. She could not afford it. There were safe but illegal clinics to get an abortion. Norma found one of those, but it cost $500. She could not afford that. She didn't have $500. She didn't have $100 to her name, nor could she afford to fly to California, where abortion was then legal, or to go to Mexico to a clinic there where various people were going. She didn't know what to do. She tells this to her adoption lawyer, and her adoption lawyer, who's a remarkable man named Henry McCluskey, who was gay, closeted but gay, and had fought the sodomy laws in Texas at the time. He says, you know what? I went to law school with a woman named Linda Coffey. She's looking to challenge the Texas abortion laws, and she's looking for a plaintiff. I can introduce you to her. And that's when Norma meets her lawyer, Linda Coffey. Coffey then partners with Sarah Weddington, and Norma becomes Jane Roe.
But most of us are unfamiliar with Linda Coffey, isn't that right? And she was not someone who people readily assumed or readily thought was part of the case, but in fact, she was instrumental. Can you tell us a little bit more about Linda Coffey and what role she played in Roe v. Wade?
You're right. Linda Coffey is a remarkable woman. She's really kind of the matriarch of Roe. She was totally forgotten. She was forgotten for two reasons. She's still alive. The first reason was she did not like the spotlight, so she did not seek it out. I'll tell you about what she did, but the second reason is her co-counsel, Sarah Weddington, liked the spotlight as much as Linda did not like it. And unfortunately, she really was not very good to her. Sarah did not treat Norma well, and she didn't treat Linda well. And as the years went by and Sarah became more and more famous, she completely cut Linda from the story, knowing that Linda would never raise her hand and say, wait, what about me? So Linda was a brilliant woman who went to law school at a time. She and Sarah were at University of Texas at Austin law school. There were very few women, like 5 out of a class of hundreds. They both did exceptionally well, but couldn't get jobs. This is what it was like to be a woman in law school in the 1960s. And Linda ends up becoming, she becomes a clerk for a very important woman, Judge Sarah Hughes. And she's a feminist. She's also a religious Baptist. And there was room for a feminist Baptist back then, room in her church, room in the Southern Baptist Convention. What I mean by that is the church had not yet sort of issued any of its announcements saying that a woman needs to be subservient, I'm paraphrasing, to her man, or saying, nor had they sort of renounced homosexuality. Linda was gay, and they had not renounced abortion. I didn't know any of this. Not only had they not renounced it, the church was very much pro-choice. And so when Linda, not until 1980, as there was this sort of shift, this ideological shift, and the evangelical community was becoming more and more pro-life, did the Southern Baptist Convention follow suit. So Linda has this idea that she wishes to challenge the court. She sees a case in California that gives her the idea to do so. She needs a plaintiff. When she then finds Norma through Henry McCluskey, and she then reaches out, as I said, to Sarah Weddington, it is Linda who conceives of its initial sort of legal arguments that they would argue that abortion ought to be legal, that it is rooted in privacy, that the Constitution guarantees a right to privacy. She is the one who files Roe. She's the one, most importantly, who has the guts to attach her name to it, which Sarah Weddington did not wish to do at the time. She also argues half of the case in the lower courts, and then she appeals the ruling up to the Supreme Court. When they get to the Supreme Court, however, it's Sarah who argues in front of the court. Linda is very content to sort of go into the sort of background, and she is, as you correctly note, forgotten. Later on, when the Southern Baptist Convention does sort of repudiate homosexuality and abortion and feminism and all these things, Linda really doesn't have room for herself in her church anymore. She moves with her partner to East Texas, and it's sad. She's quite down and out now. She lives on food stamps. She lives in a house with no heat. She's really been forgotten, but she remains proud of what she accomplished in Roe.
Yeah, I want to move now to the ruling in Roe and how, when the Supreme Court affirmed the right to abortion, it also mobilized an anti-choice movement that was in beginning and catapulted Mildred Jefferson into the national spotlight. How effective was she in furthering the anti-choice movement?
How effective was who? I didn't
Mildred Jefferson.
Oh, yeah, she's another remarkable sort of character. I mean, my goodness, so you're right. It was the Roe ruling that sort of galvanized those who were opposed to it. Now, one of the important things is, like scholars Linda Greenhouse and Reva Siegel, they point out that it isn't true that it's only Roe's quote unquote fault that it became sort of politicized, that there were people pre-Roe who were already sort of doing so. They point, for example, to Pat Buchanan, who was an advisor for Richard Nixon, President Nixon at the time. He writes a memo to the president encouraging him to come out to about face on abortion, to come out against a policy whereby abortion was legal and in military hospitals. Nixon does this. This starts pre-Roe, but it is also true that it absolutely galvanized those opposed to it, and that it helped to politicize it too. Just one other note along those lines: pre-Roe in California, when Governor Ronald Reagan signs into law the most lenient abortion law in the country, 1967, it has broad bipartisan support. But anyway, yes, Mildred Jefferson was the first Black woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School. She was a very brilliant woman born in Texas. One of the reasons she moved to Massachusetts was she wanted to sort of widen the possibility of her road to marriage. And interracial marriage was illegal in roughly half the country, which is remarkable. She ended up marrying a white man and then divorcing him. She kept that very quiet because she saw her divorce as sort of a blemish on her record. What was very important, though, is she wanted to abortion was not yet on her radar. She wanted to become a doctor, but she faced such intense racism and misogyny in the years after she graduates from medical school, over the 2 decades leading up to Roe, that she cannot become a certified surgeon. And when she's finally certified, like 20 years later, she's so exasperated and her career has been railroaded and she's not sure what to do. Well, it was right about that time that the American Medical Association says that, hey, doctors, if you work in a state where abortion is now going to be legal, you need to respect your state laws. Mildred, who had only been abortion had not been in the forefront of her mind, she's upset by this. And she decides that she is going to join various local groups that oppose legalizing abortion. She was a mesmerizing speaker. She was brilliant. She was also beautiful, which was important because she was constantly on television, and she writes herself about the effect that she could have on viewers tuning in. Well, right before, literally weeks before Roe is passed, she's on a show called The Advocates. Ronald Reagan tunes in, and we have a letter showing that he writes to her saying, "You've convinced me to change my mind on this." What's most important, what her great legacy is, she becomes the head of the National Right to Life Committee, and she is the one more than anyone who sees the power in politicizing Roe and Republicanizing Roe. And in 1976, when she's the head of the National Right to Life Committee, she makes anyone who's running for office, she makes them comment on whether or not they are in favor of a human life amendment, an amendment to the Constitution, which would say that a fetus is a person and therefore all abortion must be illegal. She's politicizing abortion. From that point on, the Democratic and Republican national at their conventions, they now take stances on Roe, whether they're for it or opposed to it. And it takes about 2 decades for the parties to sort of catch up to this. But of course, nowadays we live in a country where, if you're a Republican politician, you are opposed to Roe and vice versa. And she, more than anyone, that is her legacy. The very same movement that she sort of advanced so much eventually drops her. But she foreshadowed where we are today because she was extreme. She didn't believe in any exceptions to abortion, for example, when abortion ought to be legal. And that, of course, is now the stance of an enormous percentage of the pro-life party.
Yes, thank you. She was definitely, I think, an interesting figure. One of the things that you touch on quite, extensively throughout are sort of the contradictions that live within the personalities, the people in the book. And Mildred had her own contradictions, right? Because she did not have children. She chose not to have children. Is that right?
That's right. It's a remarkable thing. And of course, she lied about that. She didn't have children. She told people that the reason she hadn't had children was because she wasn't able to conceive, but it is not true. The reason, and I spoke to her ex-husband who was not angry and didn't have an axe to grind. He actually spoke sort of with reverence about his ex-wife. He told me that she said a precondition of their getting married was that they would not have children because she had determined that the world was so unjust and so unfair. She had suffered so much that she could not, in good conscience, bring a child into this world. And it is this same woman who was saying that every single conception must lead to a birth, which is a remarkable thing that she was able to sort of live with that. She didn't tell that to anyone, of course, but it points up that, there's the old saying, when ought to abortion be legal? Rape, incest, and meat. That if a person feels that, oh, well, I'm the exception to the rule, and yet she was not able to she didn't have it within herself to sort of project her own experience or allow what she was sort of granting herself to the millions of other women in the country who might also feel as she did.
Right. Going forward a bit, in 1992, we saw abortion again before the Supreme Court in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And that ruling implemented what we now know as the undue burden standard, allowing states to pass abortion restrictions even in the earliest stages of pregnancy. And while this was a tremendous loss for abortion access, you do write how Justice Souter in many ways saved Roe with this case and referenced a memo that one of his clerks wrote that we had previously seen before, I believe. What did that memo say? Can you tell us about that memo?
That memo was remarkable. The way that Supreme Court justices work is they work hand in hand every term with four clerks who work for them. And we don't know anything about these clerks. We later can look up their names, but they're not sort of, publicly known. And what's really incredible is we don't know where the sort of work of the clerks end and the work of the justice begins. Now, of course, it's the justice who is putting his or her name, on the opinion. But it was all but certain. People were sure that just as many are today, I'm among them, who believe that Dobbs is going to lead to the overturning of Roe. People felt that way then in 1992 about Casey. There was very good reason to think so. And behind the scenes at the 11th hour, Justice Souter asked he asked four clerks from the previous term. Let me back up. He had asked for his previous term's four clerks, write me a memo on abortion. I believe that Roe is going to sort of come on our desks again. We're going to have to weigh in on this. Three of the four clerks write memos arguing to sort of overturn Roe. Souter was a Republican appointed justice. One of the four clerks, whose memo had never been seen previously, writes saying that, hey, no, you need to uphold it. And he writes about respect for precedent, stare decisis. and that overturning Roe would cause an enormous sort of disruption in the lives of millions of women who've grown accustomed to it. He does say that, however, one thing you might wish to do to sort of strike a middle ground here is to get rid of the sort of 3-trimester framework that was the trimester framework that was outlined initially in Roe, where Roe is legal through the first trimester, legal through the second, but subject to various state restrictions, and except in the case of, a woman's life is in danger, not legal in the third, and that health, that could be mental health or physical health. Roe and its companion case, Doe said. The clerk says you can scrap that framework and instead introduce this undue burden standard, which had been once mentioned previously by Justice O'Connor. And Souter likes this idea. He convinces Justice Kennedy and Justice O'Connor to come along with him. They do so, and the three of them then join with 2 other justices and stun the court, stun their own conservative colleagues in saving Roe at the last minute. So it's really this unknown memo that got us exactly where we are today. Now, of course, that clerk and Justice Souter did not sort of foresee what would happen, that phrase would then open up the floodgates to the sort of incremental dismantling of Roe with these endless restrictions, which of course is where we are today. So it was a complicated thing.
Yeah, that's remarkable, I thought, to read about that. Going back to Norma, it was roughly around this time that she moved from being supporting abortion rights to aligning herself with the anti-choice establishment. Can you talk a little bit about the role that class played in this decision?
I'm so glad you raised that, because that to me, I think, was maybe the most important realization for me in the whole book. There was a sociologist in California, Kristen Luker, who wrote a lot about how class divided the 2 sides in this camp. It was often the sort of women of a lower class who saw themselves, who weren't as educated or this or that, who were opposed to Roe, and women who were educated and who placed their jobs ahead of family. There were all these sort of different criteria, but class, she felt, was the sort of latchkey that opened it all up. But what I was seeing over and again was that there were divisions of class within the pro-choice movement as well. And I thought that was really sad. And that came to a head, or it was, manifest in Norma's story, because Norma was not educated, and she was often, she wanted very much to have a seat at the table, as she, for about a decade after Roe, maybe 15 years, 1973, 1988 or so, she's really unknown. People don't even know her name, even though she had identified herself in 1973 in a little Baptist newsletter. She gave an interview. 1989, she wishes to sort of join people more and more in the front lines in fighting for Roe, which she called my law. But to be perfectly honest, she was marginalized. She didn't speak the language. She often didn't say things properly. She had lied previously, saying that she had gotten pregnant by a rape, which was not true. She later recanted. So they were understandably uncomfortable with her. But still, it is true that they did not give her a seat at the table, the leaders of the movement. Over and again, they sort of marginalized her. And Norma was very upset about this. And she starts saying, hey, if I was a better educated woman, if I spoke better, then they'd trust me more. They'd give me a chance more. And one of her partners tried to educate her. She taught her this sort of language. She taught her, she explained to her place in the sort of pantheon of women who had fought for rights over the years, reproductive rights. But nonetheless, she's really marginalized. And in 1992, when Sarah Weddington, her former lawyer, writes a book in which she tells that she had had an abortion herself, and that she had worked at an abortion referral clinic, and had nonetheless, Norma is telling herself, nonetheless not helped her to see if it was possible for her to have an abortion. Norma is very angry. She feels used. And at the very same time, the sort of people on the other side were reaching out to her. And there was an evangelical minister named Flip Benham who set up shop right next to the abortion clinic where Norma was working at that point in Dallas, and sort of reaching out to her and saying, hey, we love you, they don't love you, we care about you, we don't just care about Jane Roe, come to our side, and he preys upon her, and he's successful. He wins her over. And it is true that religion was something that was a comfort to Norma later in her life, but it is also undoubtedly true that had she felt that she was welcome by the pro-choice leaders, that she would not have left. And she spoke about class, not using that word, but she felt that these were her people, more on the pro-life side. And so she aligns herself with them. In the end, what's really interesting and sad is she feels sort of just as exploited by people on that side and used. And she really feels that there isn't a place for her on either side. And what's so interesting was, to me, in a sense, in one way, she really represented this sort of majoritarian middle ground of Americans. Obviously, we know that the great majority of Americans support a right to an abortion, but up to that support drops by the trimester. And she believed that abortion ought to be legal through the first trimester only. And so in a sense, she did sort of represent this large middle ground and didn't have a home in either camp.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you had mentioned that, as you're also speaking, is Norma's perhaps not so much inability, but I guess playing with the truth a lot, right? Ultimately, to put it bluntly, she lied quite a bit. How did you determine, as a journalist, as a writer, as a reporter, as a writer, when to trust her, when she was lying, and when she was not?
You're right. She lied endlessly. And writing about someone like that is very, very difficult. She lied about everything. She said that her mother kidnapped her child when in fact, and I'll answer your question, when in fact she had begged her mother to sort of take the child off her hands. She said that her husband had beaten her when in fact the reason that marriage ended, that first quick marriage, was because he had found out that she had found out that he was cheating. She said that she was raped 3 different times. She said while she was in Catholic school, a nun had raped her, when in fact she had had sort of a consensual experience with a woman who was not yet a nun, but was going to become a nun, and on and on and on. So how did I determine this? Well, there were 3 ways, really. The first way was that I was very lucky. I mentioned early on that Norma had a partner, a woman named Connie Gonzalez, and Norma had left Connie in 2009. And I went to Connie just by chance in 2010. And Norma had left behind all of her papers in Connie's garage. Those papers were about to be thrown out. And I said, wait, please don't throw them out. I would like those papers. I then got the papers. I asked Norma, would you like them? She said no. I legally purchased the papers from her. Those papers are now in the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, open to researchers. I gave the proceeds of the sale of that, just as an aside, to the children of Norma after the book finished. But those papers, though they were a complete mess and a jumble, and they were just sort of all over the place, they were, when I went through them, thousands of papers, they were a roadmap to her life. There would be a name there. Who is this person? Tax forms, letters, etc. So I was able to, here were facts. So, so to give one example, Norma had said that, well, I was able to find with Norma's help her education record, which pointed to the name of a woman she was when she tried to go back and get a second time. She went back to high school, tried to get a degree. It mentioned who she was living with at that time. It turned out to be her first real girlfriend. And this woman was enabled me to say no. I was living with Norma at the time when she was begging her mother to take the child off of her hands. Melissa, the child was not kidnapped, just to give one example. So I had these papers. The second was I conducted literally hundreds of interviews, going back to find credible witnesses to people at every single stage along Norma's life. And the third was going back to find all of the interviews Norma had given, even in tiny little publications. So years before she started telling everyone what I mentioned earlier, that, you know, when she wanted to have an abortion, she'd gone to this clinic and it had just been shuttered and there was blood all over the place. She had mentioned in a small newspaper in 1981, hey, actually, I just simply couldn't afford it. So it was those 3 things. And then I would go to Norma when I'd found the truth and I'd say, Norma, look, here's where you say X, here's where you say Y. let's talk about this. And she would often just smile. And she even said to me once, I like my version better. What was interesting to me was it wasn't just playful. What she was doing, there was a theme, there was a sort of a thread to all of her lies. She was reimagining herself as not a sinner, but a victim. So she said, no, I didn't commit a sin here of having sex with a woman, as she saw it, but rather I was raped. Or I didn't commit the sin of not wishing to be a mother and trying to get rid of my child, rather the child was kidnapped, and on and on and on. And in the end, Norma, who had lived such a complicated life, she actually wanted the truth told. She helped me. She was so happy, for example, when the name of the man who had fathered her second child her third child, the child who later came to be known as the Roe baby, came to her mind. And she told me, and that enabled me to go find him.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that, because you were able to find, if I remember correctly, the half brother of Melissa, Norma's oldest daughter, the fathers of her two younger daughters.
Yeah, that's right.
And you also found Norma's youngest daughter on your own. So how did you approach people when you found them? I think it's remarkable that you found, those folks. How did you approach them and gain their trust?
That was a difficult thing. I mentioned sort of in passing that when I first reached out to the quote unquote Roe baby, I made it very clear. I reached out first to her mother, so I would not be shocking Shelley if she hadn't known who she'd been born to. And then when she first said, I don't wish to participate, I said, okay, you have it. You have my word. I will never write about you against your wishes. When she later decided that she wished to participate, she said, given this enormous secret that she was carrying, that she was the quote unquote Roe baby, she said, please don't ever speak to anyone about me without asking me first. So I did, I was very careful with these folks. But I have to step back. I mentioned that I'd often written about people who carried these sort of secrets, like that anonymous photographer. Well, I have come to see that it is a great burden for people to carry a great secret. And all the more so if the secret you're carrying is something connected to something tens of millions of people care about. I wrote about a baseball game where these ball players have carried a great secret for 50 years. It's not an easy thing. And so I assumed that these people are conflicted. Part of them wants to tell their story, part of them doesn't want to tell their story. And if I can say, look, I'm fair. I'm going to write about you with empathy. I'm going to write about you with understanding. I'm going to make sure to write the truth, but I don't have an axe to grind here. I don't have, I'm going to let you tell your story. And the other thing was I had so many years. It took so many years. So years could go by and people could say, you know what, I'm not ready right now, but come back to me in 2 more years. And I would then also say, hey, would you like to go over, I didn't show them the actual words, but would you like to go over all of the things I've written about? And tell me if I've gotten it right. Tell me if there's something you think I'm getting wrong. So little by little, it took time, but people did choose to tell me their stories. There were only 1 or 2 people whose stories in the whole book I wasn't able to include because they didn't wish to have them involved, but I'm still trying.
One of the sweetest moments in the book is when Norma's 3 daughters gather together for the first time. And it's a bit emotional for me because I have 2 sisters, so I kind of imagine myself in that position. Can you tell us about that gathering?
Yeah, I'll just say it's such a nice thing to speak to someone who read the book so carefully and who clearly responded to the things that mattered to me. Like you talked about class before, and you talk about this. This was a very beautiful moment. These women, all women, and it's a book about women. 6 of the 7 central characters are women, setting aside even that it's about Roe v. Wade. These were women who had all had very difficult lives, not only because they had been born to Norma McCorvey, who, from whom they sort of had these difficult inheritances, genetic inheritances. Norma had done, she'd also done drugs and alcohol during their abused drugs and alcohol during her pregnancies with them, which she was very open about, but also they'd had sort of different difficult experiences as a result of this. Being put up for adoption can be a difficult experienced. Some of the homes in which they were raised were complicated. And finding out who they had been born to was an enormous comfort for them, because just setting aside that Norma was Jane Roe, filling in missing pieces in their lives. But what they really wanted to know was who their sisters were. They had been told, each of them, that they had half sisters. They didn't know who these women were. And I didn't sort of play God. I didn't bring them together without their wanting to do so. They had all looked for each other in vain in the years previous to their coming together in 2013 when I brought them together. But here they were, and it was very beautiful. They came together at the home of the eldest, Melissa Mills, a woman who more than anything was desperate for her family, to find these people. There's obviously a difference between just family and sort of genetic relationships, if you're connected to someone. And yet she wanted family. She didn't just want these people to sort of fill out a family tree on a sheet. She wanted them to be her sisters. And they struggled. It was hard in some ways. But on that first day, it was very beautiful. They all came together and they were comparing notes, comparing their sort of life stories, the things they had in common, the things they did not have in common, talking a little bit about Norma. Melissa had known Norma. She was the only one who did. Talking about how difficult a person she was, talking about abortion, talking about their partners. And then, it couldn't have been scripted anymore, sort of remarkably. Their dinner was getting ready and they walked outside. This is in 2013. And there happened to be, in the subdivision where Melissa lives, a little playground right across the street. And they walk across the street to the playground. And they just sort of all get on the swings and start swinging, sort of, grown women at that point, but sort of making up for lost childhoods that they didn't have to share. And it was a very beautiful moment, you're right, to witness. Again, life gets more complicated after that, but at that one day, it was very special.
Well, thank you, Joshua. Yes, it was a beautiful. You described it very beautifully in the book.
Thank you.
I have one last question for you. Kind of bringing it back to where we are now. As you know, here in Texas, we have an active ban on abortion from the point that there is embryonic cardiac activity that's been in place since September 1st. We also have a case, before the Supreme Court, the Jackson versus Women's Health Organization, that we expect a ruling from this next month or so. Can you tell us, closing out, how do you hope your book, The Family Roe, will inform conversations about abortion here in the U.S., and particularly where we are at this moment?
So I'm not naive, and I know that there are people who, no matter what stories they are told, will sort of hold as fast and unflinchingly to their points of view as they always have. But the epigraph of my book is from Moby Dick, and Herman Melville writes, "See how elastic our stiff prejudices grow when love once comes to bend them." That basically, if you know someone, if you care for that person, it's very difficult to be prejudiced against them. And I will tell you, I was just on a podcast with the head of the largest Southern Baptist Convention seminary in America. And he, Dr. Albert Mohler, was speaking about how he found the book very moving, including the stories of people on the other side. He had not spoken this way before about this issue. And I do think, and obviously this is something that I didn't invent, people in the pro-choice movement believe that the power of story is important. That is why there's this flurry of sort of online initiatives to have people tell the stories of their abortions. Again, what has happened right now is sort of remarkable to me, that, the women where you work and the work that you do is now you are up against perhaps, an immovable force. I do believe that in the long run, if, for example, Roe is overturned and it goes back to the states and abortion ends up legal in roughly half the country and illegal in roughly half the country, my personal belief is that the kind of work that I was able to do here can serve as a way to sort of supplement the work that you do on the front lines. That the long haul, and again, the pro-choice movement really didn't do this all these years. they looked at Roe in 1973 as the end, as a victory. Now we have won. We can sort of move forward little by little. As those opposed to Roe began to sort of chip away at it, they came to see that that wasn't the case. But I do think that in the long haul, humanizing people, humanizing the reasons that women, the unbelievably crucial and inarguable reasons that a woman might wish to have an abortion, if those people's stories are humanized, that can only in the long run benefit their cause.
Joshua Prager, thank you so much for joining us today. The Family Roe is available at the Nowhere Bookshop tent across the street. I'd like to thank our audience today for attending the San Antonio Book Festival. Whether you're joining us in person or virtually, we hope you enjoy the many of the festival's offerings on this 10th anniversary. Thank you again.
Thank you very, very much.